So, welcome to this final plenary of Battle of Ideas Buxton. It really has been a very stimulating day. I have listened to and heard a whole range of arguments that I disagree with, as well as those that I agree with, and that's the way it should be. Plenty to think about. And we wanted to finish off, on the one hand, with a call to arms, but on the other hand, a bit more than that, to kind of just try and explore what we're up against. And so therefore this panel is called Call to Courage, Is Anything Worth Fighting For? And I suppose the context for this is quite simply that we live in a society in which the people who run society are from different political parties, all spineless. And therefore, the notion of courage is one that seems to me to be particularly important to look at. But there's something else going on as well, which is that, sorry, I'm just aware of the fact that people are coming in. When people say that they're being courageous, they will often say, I am being bullied, I am being brave and standing up. I demand that you protect me because I'm vulnerable and I want you to cancel or sack the person who's bullying me. So courage takes a very peculiar form, and rather than the traditional notions of valour that we might expect to be associated with courage, it's often the case that what we value in society today is the notions of vulnerability and being a victim. So you will find a situation in which young people in particular, but certainly not exclusively, will claim that they are likely to get post-traumatic stress disorder if they are not exposed to war or serious disaster, but if they're exposed to a novel that's got disturbing scenes in it. And I'm not, it's easy to lampoon it, but it is peculiar that we live in a culture like that, and where people think they're being courageous listening to somebody give a speech with ideas in it that they don't agree with. That's kind of considered to be the kind of height of courage. It's also the case that the concept of cancel culture makes cowards of us all. We're all frightened to speak often on certain topics because we worry that we will be demonised and cancelled, right? So that's a kind of background context. But there are signs of people just not accepting the status quo and fighting back. I started off today making the point that the strike had been called off because of the success of the RMT having the courage to stand up for what they believed. We have campaign groups like Enough is Enough, Together. We have gender-critical feminists who are not prepared to tolerate the obliteration of women and the undermining of women's rights for a fashion. We have indications that people do want to organise, and today has demonstrated from what people have said that they want to fight back in different ways, right, on different issues. And so I think we can take that as something to be welcomed. And so we've gathered together some people who have been involved in various ways of thinking about it. I've got no idea what they're going to talk about, because one of the things that we asked was, is anything worth fighting for? And I suppose the theme of today has been, what our responsibility is to work out what it is we think it's worth fighting for, rather than just criticising the people that are spineless, right? That our task and our courage requires not that we whinge, but that we actually start working out the demands that we want to place on society, what kind of world we want. So, let me introduce the panel in the order in which they'll speak. We'll be starting with Dennis Hayes, who spoke at the beginning of the day as a professor of education at the University of Derby, the author of The Death of Academic Freedom, very importantly, the founder and director of Academics for Academic Freedom, and again, extraordinary that one would need to have an organisation called Academics for Academic Freedom, But he's, you know, there's been attempts at cancelling him for just organising that. And he's also, very importantly, the person who really brought the Battle of Ideas to Buxton. If it wasn't for Dennis, we wouldn't be here. He started that last year, or as he said, the year before, and we got cancelled because of COVID. But nonetheless, it's Dennis's work that's brought us here. Can we just give him a very warm sitting next to me then is Marion Calder, who is the co-director of For Women Scotland. Marion has been fearless, and I mean fearless, in taking on the SNP and the Scottish Government on the issue of women's rights and all that is entailed in it. I hardly need to explain to you the detail of it. But we know that speaking out on the issues of gender, gender identity, and women at the moment is actually an incredibly precarious thing to do. And so Marion never balks. And in that sense, she is one of my heroines. Can we give her a warm welcome? Charlie Winstanley, who'll speak then, is the Northwest coordinator of Enough is Enough, one of the big new campaigns that's emerged in relation to the cost of living crisis. He's also a political advisor to the Mayor of Salford, and he's also somebody that I've known a long time, fought with over every single possible political issue in the world. It's courageous that he was doing that from the age of 17. He took me on. I mean, you must admit, right? And he never stood a chance. But we have managed through it all to actually, I think, have mutual respect for the fact that we actually speak in good faith and believe what we say. And that even though ever since I particularly went Brexit and then stuff for the Brexit Party, have been denounced as some far-right fascist harridan. And Charlie is very firmly on the left. He has never at least abandoned the notion that I might be somebody that you sit on a platform with. So that's courage to me. Charlie Winston. And then last but not least, we have Alan Miller. Alan was a businessman who was the co-founder of the Old Truman Brewery, who set up the Nighttime Industries Association, and he became a crucial and remains a crucial figure in relation to lockdown-associated campaigns, Open for All and Recovery. And very importantly, I think now, his new campaign, and there's been leaflets around and he'll tell you more about it, is Together. And Together have taken the liberated, sometimes, politicised people who kind of hadn't noticed politics before lockdown and turn a narrow discussion in relation to lockdown to a serious discussion and campaigning group around civil liberties in general, about reclaiming democracy, and never ever balks again from having the arguments that are needed in society. So we're delighted to have Alan with us. Can we give him a warm Okay, no further ado. Let's hear from Dennis, please.
James Woodhousen on the first panel told us all off, if you were there. I don't know if James is here. But, for not listening. He told us off for not listening and not... and I think that's a fair point, that, free speech involves listening. And I've been listening to what people said, and throughout the day, people have said things like, we need a debate, we need a discussion, we need to engage into some public debate. So my argument today is that what's worth fighting for is free speech, right? And we do need to fight for it. And I'll tell you why, because free speech is not just one freedom like any other, right? There are lots of freedoms, and people try and trade them off. But free speech is a foundational freedom. So without free speech, all those other freedoms are lost. Right? And the claim is often made, it's free speech is foundational. Right? So I thought I would just spend some time trying to convince you of that. And one of the reasons is you form your opinions through experience and arguing with others, and others form their experiences with arguing with you. And that's how we come to know what we actually know. But if you don't have that experience, you don't know what others think, but you don't know what you think either. Right? It's not you're just mouthing things like a parrot. So I just go back a little bit to when AFAF was set up, because Roy Harris, who was the Emeritus Professor of General Linguistics at Oxford, and I were writing articles about free speech in the Times Higher and whatever. And we thought, what can we do? You know, we keep writing these things, they don't seem to have any effect. So over a long dinner in Oxford, and I tell you, Roy was the founder of integrationist linguistics. After 2.5 hours, my brain hurt. Right? He was really demanding. But we decided to set up AFAF through a statement that people could sign. So you can still sign it. It's on the website. Leaflets out there with it on of academic freedom. And yet, you know, he did argue that it was foundational freedom. So when I was editing a special edition of the British Journal of Educational Studies on academic freedom, I asked him to write a defence of free speech as the foundational freedom. Interestingly, he did it on philosophy of education, but he looked at Plato, Aristotle and Socrates and their attitudes towards free speech. Who failed? No, not all of them.
I don't do it.
No, don't do it. No, it's a rhetorical statement. So, and towards the end of the paper, he gave a general rationale for giving priority to freedom of speech. I'm going to read it slowly. It's quite complicated, but follow with me. Right. He said, the general rationale for giving priority to freedom of speech can be stated very succinctly. For any proposed freedom, being free may turn out to be an illusion if there has been no opportunity to test that freedom claimed against contrary opinions. In short, we cannot know that we even enjoy freedom and not know what exercising that freedom would be, what exercising that freedom would be, until that freedom has been subjected to and survived unrestricted critical scrutiny. Unrestricted critical scrutiny. And that requires freedom of speech. For if we rely on anything short of that, the freedom we have imagined we had may be illusory. Right? So you may be, in fact, if you don't put your ideas forward for unrestricted critical scrutiny, you do not even know what you think. Right? And you may well be living a lie. But of course, you do not have to put ideas to unrestricted critical scrutiny or any sort of critical scrutiny at all. And you may respond by hiding away in a safe space. So I think that tends to happen now, in a sticking and gluing room or a poster wall. These are two, we both know, two things that happened recently. But the worst thing, of course, the other alternative is to engage in violence. To misquote Churchill, remember, to George always better than war. He never said that, but he said something similar. But I think it's true. And I think if you understand the foundational nature of free speech, then you've got to oppose all restrictions on speech, all forms of censorship, and defend free speech, no ifs, no buts. Because free censorship is not kind. Censorship is actually a violent act. And it actually denies your humanity, right? Meaning that you're not capable of listening to alternative opinions. I mean, the irony when people don't want to listen to them, they're saying, I don't want to be fully human. I don't want to be treated as an autonomous human being who can listen to criticism and develop my own ideas. It's a terrible situation we're in. But I think this is my suggestion for you, what you can all do. Because discussing academic freedom in Canterbury last Wednesday, someone asked, are you a free speech absolutist? And I thought it was sort of a claim like, are you mentally ill? I thought, perhaps I should go and join Absolutists Anonymous. But when somebody accuses you of being a free speech absolutist, it isn't a suggestion that you need therapy. It simply means that you believe in free speech. Right? So that's what I think you should all do. You should all become free speech absolutists. It's a good badge to wear.
Thanks for that challenge, Dennis. That was a very good way to start. Marion.
Thank you. Scotland the brave. Perhaps not. No longer the land of the kilted, wielding claymores, charging warriors, but a land where stickers and ribbons and suffragette colours send MSPs into tailspin of trauma and trigger reports under draconian hate crime laws. Our First Minister herself has made public statements condemning those who speak up against gender ideology, or as I like to put it, those who are sane. The fact that there are two sexes and that you cannot change sex is now not valid in Scotland. There you are. For example, an MSP complained that a women's rally, organised by my own organisation for Women Scotland, outside Parliament, triggered her as a domestic violence survivor. Keep in mind, this is where protests happen daily, and that women were protesting about men who identify as women being given access to vulnerable women and children. I quote, "To see the colours of suffrage waving around while they raged at me was very disconcerting. I shook my head and walked away." She was looking down from a window from the corridors of power, never probably expecting to be back in a domestic violence women's aid centre with men. Can't imagine that anymore. In Scotland, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill is progressing at great speed. This bill allows anyone to change their sex on their birth certificate. Not just transgender, not transsexual, anyone. The term transgender doesn't appear on the face of the bill. Last week, there was a stage 1 debate. The bill was voted to progress by 80 to 33 in favour of the bill progressing. One might be forgiven for thinking that Scottish MSPs are disproportionately burning with the conviction that sex is a matter of self-will and that abusive men have never tried to exploit gaping loopholes to access victims. One of our MSPs, Maggie Chapman, a Green MSP, last week was a perfect example of this type. She was basically read like a sermon about how important that gender ideology was and that they were all to flock to her. Crazy. However, many of the MSPs are far too frightened to speak the truth. The clashes with the monolithic government-funded organisations, such as Stonewall, Scottish Trans Alliance, the Women's Organisation and Gender, all have been absolutely captured by this ideology. It is almost impossible to actually get a foot in the door to actually speak with parliamentarians because they constantly refer back to groups that they actually fund themselves. We have met with opposition MSPs whose jobs should hold the government to account and question their policies. They agreed fully with us that men are not women and that the current trend was dangerous for women and girls, but whose courage nevertheless failed them. One especially disappointing example was the former leader of Scottish Labour, Kezia Dugdale, who was one of the very first MSPs we spoke to and fully understood our concerns. She even raised questions for us in Parliament, and especially about the funding of women's services and about how the women's domestic violence rape crisis services were wholly, you would not get funding unless you would actually take men into the service. So that's absolutely, you had to actually state that you would actually take men into the service. I don't use the word trans, I use men. Yeah, just for clarity there. Yeah, in her final speech to Parliament, she started parroting the lines, perhaps worried that her future kind of career in a think tank based in Glasgow would be jeopardised. She gave up, no courage at all. In contrast, however, we have the example of her predecessor, Joanne Lamont, whose powerful speeches in defence of women shamed the government and triggered the biggest climb down the last parliamentary session with a 6-word debate. 6 words were for the word gender, insert sex. This was the ability for a woman accessing forensic services after rape to request the sex of their practitioner. They wanted to have it gender. But we triggered that. She was supported by SNP MSPs led by Joe McAlpine, who threatened a revolt if the rape victims were not protected. In the end, only Lib Dems and Greens voted against the amendment. It triggered the resignation of Andy Whiteman, a principled Green MSP. That was courage. And he resigned in the face of much abuse from his former party colleagues. Shocking. Most of the heroes of sick words are no longer in Parliament. Some are retired. Joan was manoeuvred out, and as I said, and Andy also lost his place as List MSP. It seemed the price for courage was steep. Yet last week, Ash Regan, a minister, chose to vote with her conscience and voted against stage 1 of the Engendered Recognition Reform Bill, despite a 3-line whip from government. Her bravery undoubtedly inspired her, others, and 6 other SNP MSPs who defied the vote, and against 2 more which abstained. Courage in her case really did call to courage. It's not enough, not yet, but we know there are many others, both her in her party and in Labour, who know this bill is wrong. We need them to find their spine now, before it's too late. It's repeatedly said that the more that people stand up, the harder it has, or harder it will be, to shut down or silence dissenting voices. We vote for politicians to serve and lead and oppose the government and hold them to account. It would be nice if some of them remembered that in the upcoming weeks. Ironically, Nicola Sturgeon likes to posture at the Braveheart Awards that recognises bravery and heroism for members of the public, but she punishes other forms of courage, whether it's from her own MSPs or ordinary women. If she really was a Braveheart, she would believe in true freedom, and she would have the courage to fight the political battles and debate those who oppose her on gender ID, instead of demonising opponents, dismissing them as not valid, or pretending that she'd never heard about their concern. On my final note, just to pick up on something that you said, years ago, I appeared in a Clydesdale Bank advert. I had one line, and I had to do multiple retakes on this. I kept messing it up. But I haven't messed it up as much as the First Minister. So feeling courageous, I'll give it another go today. Freedom.
Thanks, Marion. That was excellent, but also depressing when you consider... No, depressing because that is a political climate we all recognised, given with gory detail, I'm afraid, but also very inspiring at the end. Charlie.
Thanks. No, I wanted to start just by giving some potentially more kind of uplifting examples, because I'm coming from a situation where I think individual acts of bravery, I think, are still very present in our society, and there are just a few that come to mind for me personally. I don't know if anyone here has heard the name Anna Campbell. Anna Campbell was an acquaintance of mine at university, and in 2019, she was killed fighting ISIS in Riyadh on behalf of the state of Kurdistan. You knew her family, yeah. I occupied the university buildings with her for about 3 months. Yeah. You know, that happened in 2019. As Claire mentioned at the start, I've come down from sort of Salford way, and there's a local legend of a trade unionist in Salford called George Tapp, who in 2013 refused to get out of the way as a car drove through the picket line at BAM Construction. The car broke both his legs, sent him to hospital for 6 months. You know, George is back up and fighting, but he didn't stand down. Another Salford legend, Alan Henning, who was also killed by ISIS, tortured and murdered for running humanitarian relief again for Kurds in Kurdistan as well. And I just wanted to make these kind of points because I think that, you know, in terms of this kind of cultural argument about all of the sort of the different sort of stress and strains on people, I think it's something to remember that, you know, individual acts of courage and bravery are still very present. There are still people out there who are willing to really put their lives on the line, their bodies on the line for what they believe in. But I think that what is really clear, and this pertains back to what Claire started with at the beginning, is I think there's less of a culture of heroism than there used to be, and particularly at the top of institutions. This was really driven home to me recently when I've been creating a small documentary, a mini documentary on the Salford rent strike from 1972, lasted for 2 years. And the rent strike was led by Salford Council, and at the time, the Labour group on Salford Council rejected the Fair Rents Act, which had been introduced by government, which would have put £1 on the rent for all the council houses. It wasn't the pound itself, it was the fact that under Ted Heath, the idea was that there should not be a thing as subsidised housing, so it was an attack on the concept of council housing itself. And I think the thing that really struck me, speaking to these councillors who were there at the time, is that every single one of them was willing to go to prison for that. Councillors, an elected council, as a position of the council, taking a motion to council which was about breaking the law. I know lots of examples of this back in the 70s and the 80s even. You go through the 70s and the 80s, and there were many different local politicians taking this kind of stance, something that's unheard of today. It really reminded me, I was in Northern Ireland in probably about 2015, and I was told about a local MP, Jerry Kelly, in 2013, who had jumped onto the bonnet of a police car to protest against one of his residents being arrested, as he believed unjustly, and was driven down the street on the bonnet of this police car before the police car braked and he fell off and broke his arm. I think he broke his arm. But yeah, and I remember thinking when I was being told this story at the time, wow, our politicians don't do that. That's not how it rocks in mainland UK. But it used to be, and I think what this comes back to for me is I think that what we've got now is a bunch of captured institutions at the top of British society, both in the political parties and in a lot of the organisations which may have once actually led the charge, which is why people who get into leadership positions in this country anymore are no longer able to sort of express this kind of courage in the same way that they used to be. We've got so many processes in the way of filtering people out and ensuring that by the time you get to any kind of position of prominence in British politics, you're certainly not the type of person that's going to stand in front of a car that's driving at you at 60 miles an hour or go and join an international brigade to fight against ISIS in Syria or Kurdistan. And there's so many facets behind this problem. And I think some of the really interesting ones which were brought out in the preface that the speakers were given before this session were the kind of the cultural side of things. It was about this culture, the victim mentality, the idea that actually, what is brave now is accepting your vulnerability and espousing it to the world and bringing everybody in and other authorities calling on them to protect you. And I think there's a lot of legitimacy in that. I think it's a suffocating way of thinking, which really prevents the idea that you need to, that there's a way to sort of to cultivate that culture of courage. Because I think what you really need to cultivate a culture of courage, what's an act of bravery? An act of bravery is standing up in the face of incredible odds and facing it down and accepting that there's going to be consequences for you. And if we're to rely on there being things other than just those individual isolated acts of bravery, if we're trying to build a culture of bravery, we need to be offering some payment back to people who make those acts, which compensates them in some way for what they've lost. We need to be creating that culture of honour, prestige. There needs to be social capital. And I think that in the past there used to be for these kind of things in a way that there just isn't today. And I think that part of that is this culture around championing vulnerability. And again, I've experienced that directly in political circles as well. I know that I have friends who back in the day, used to physically fight with people at the National Front. I think Claire might have been one of those. Still...
Not the National Front, the fight.
Yeah.
For the cameras.
Yeah. No, she used to fight against the National Front, or at least get fought by them. I remember when I was first getting involved in politics as a teenager, it was perfectly acceptable for the old-timers to hark back to these stories and revel in the glory days, and that was something which I think was absolutely good and proper. Nowadays, that's considered to be macho. That's considered to be, exclusionary. It's considered to be really, pumping up some kind of unhealthy, toxic idea about what it means to be involved in these kind of things. I think that's just sort of one indicator about the way that the discourse has changed, which has this self-limiting sort of effect upon that. I also think, though, as well, we've had a huge political revolution in this country, and there's one I wanted to finish on, really, is I think one of the things that we've gone back to now is an ideological situation which returns us to what I would call the Thatcherite ideology of there is no alternative. I think we've got, between both major parties, effectively no lines of disagreement. I think we've got a broad-speaking economic orthodoxy which exists across the professional sort of realms of the political spectrum, which I think was revealed very recently with the transition from the ill-fated Truss government, where we went from, in my opinion, what was effectively an attempt by Truss to operate in the interests of a rapacious global finance capital to a direct takeover by rapacious global finance capital of the UK government. An irony which isn't lost on me anyway. But I think what we've got now as well, which I think impinges upon this, is a real hegemony of ideas at the top of society about what is right and what is proper, and an idea that anybody who steps against those kind of ideas is completely out of the pale and unacceptable. And we also have this hugely bureaucratic array of measures which, just to finish on this one, I think, basically, I think one of the other big things that's changed here is that when it comes down to it, I think a lot of people in the past would have been willing to take a beating. They would have been willing to be strapped back into the back of the police car, had the shit kicked out of them, dropped out on the end of the street and walk away. That's something which people can handle. I think something which people can't handle as much is having a criminal record which follows you for the rest of your life, guarantees that you're never going to have proper employment again, guarantees that you're going to be observed and surveyed for the rest of your life, guarantees you're going to live in financial insecurity. And I think we've potentially moved from a much more crude and direct form of sort of social control in that respect to one which is much more pernicious, manipulative. It's based on the ideas which people are using. It's based upon the strategies which are employed to subdue people. And I think all of these things are things which we really do need to fight against. And I think we need to remember, like I say, to really glorify those who do stand up against the grain, make a stand, and put themselves in halfway for the things that they believe in.
Thanks, Charlie. Just to say to you from earlier in the discussions today, that because so much of political life is now technocratic, those people that you aptly illustrated being brave and, as you say, taking a beating for what they believed or going to extraordinary things, is because they knew what they believed. They had principles that they believed, and I do think that people are extraordinarily brave when they feel that they're being called upon. I mean, because I'm a total physical coward, but then you feel, well, I know I'm not letting that happen, right? But if you're a technocrat, it's like, what? I mean, you don't know what the principles are. So I think that's something we can come back to. Alan.
Thank you, Claire. This has been a great day, and it's been really interesting to hear from everyone. I wanted to look at the question of courage and go back a bit about it, and then in the context of it, is anything worth fighting for? But I think three things I'd say about courage is that it inspires people, it's inspiring, it's infectious, and it leads to solidarity. But the first steps of courage that we should dare to know, or what was called sapere aude, have the courage to use your own reason, as the Roman poet Horace proclaimed. And Immanuel Kant in 1784, when he was thinking, what is enlightenment? He said, the Enlightenment has as its clarion rallying cry, dare to know things through reason, dare to be wise. So it was in 20 BC that Horace suggests the value of human endeavour, of persistence and reaching a goal, the need for effort to overcome obstacles, to dare to know, to reason, and indeed to speak up against the mores of the day. This, of course, takes courage. It's the courage of the individual to dare to know that will break the shackles of despotism and reveal through public discourse for the overall benefit of society, Kant tells us. So what is courage? Socrates was courageous in that he allowed himself to conclude that he didn't know anything. In Plato's dialogue, Aeschines, he pushes his fellows on what constitutes courage. For there can be evil pursued vigorously as well and enthusiastically, but this is not courage. Courage comes in the public sphere, in the public domain. We all can show levels of personal courage privately, as well as on the battlefields publicly. But it's in the public sphere, in the public realm, that courage is really essential. And we see that in the Apology in Crito, we see that the trial of the death of Socrates shows him to be for the man he was, his commitment to being virtuous in the most dire of circumstances. Plato shows that the injustice of his trial and his willingness to suffer in the service of truth, this was courageous. Martin Luther wrote in the Disputation of the Power of Indulgences, also known as the 95 Theses, which he nailed to the door of the church in Wittenberg, denouncing indulgences. The church ordered Luther to retract his statements, as we know, but he refused, repeatedly making statements denying the papal foundations of the church, demonstrating immense bravery. He went on to say, I cannot recant, and I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. And we know René Descartes, who's famous for I think, therefore I am, he explains that hope and fear are both always together in any pursuit, which requires courage to pursue the truth and goals. We've seen that everyone from the Levellers to the Chartists, we've seen the agreement of the people. Perhaps William Walwyn nailed it in the comments of courage when he said, a few diligent and valiant spirits may turn the world upside down and shall with life and courage engage accordingly. There's a reason why I quote some of these people, because when we get into our modern period, we know many examples of courage demonstrated as well, from the suffragettes who risked beatings, imprisonments and vilification in their demands for universal voting rights, to the civil rights movement and I Have a Dream, which ricocheted through the world, also led to national independence movements and things like that. But when considering all these historical examples, we often think of profound and terrifying things, leaders that gained independence of nation states and heretics who were tortured and burned and things like that. But in the contemporary sphere, if we think about Arthur Miller's Crucible and the hunt for witches, in the contemporary sphere, I would also argue that we need to have courage, we need to have a sense of duty and commitment to principles, to one another, to ideas and values and what the Greeks called virtue. Here I stand, I can do no other. In order to have courage about what matters, that means to debate openly, freely, to be able to challenge, to learn new things. Just as George Orwell did when he was bravely fighting in the Spanish Civil War and then went on to critique what he saw was the problem with Stalinism and be courageous in that which led to Animal Farm. And we should remember that courage, through our acts, is infectious. To speak freely for free speech when you may lose your career and reputation, to be heretic against the new form of inquisitions takes immense bravery. When we stand up, when we speak out and challenge, it inspires others. It's what creates solidarity and then gets those that think similarly and encourages them to stand together too. Now, I'm sure we all remember what we were doing on the day Boris Johnson announced that we were to stay home, that Britain was to have an entirely new imposition called lockdowns. Jettisoning the entire pandemic strategy, this ill-thought-out draconian attack on the demos, on the people, was followed by many egregious assaults. Vaccine passports on Freedom Day, vaccine mandates for care workers and NHS staff, suspending Parliament and scrutiny, no cost-benefit analysis, suppression of free speech and critical inquiry with Stasi-like reference to following the science and keeping you safe, education damage, families isolated, loved ones dying alone, nudge and psychological propaganda, more lockdowns. But many were courageous. Brave frontline NH staff had been at the coalface for the entire period, said no to some of these measures. Many hospitality venues around the country said they would not institute these measures against the public and against people that were coming and would be open for all. Ordinary people up and down the country came to national protests and local rallies to challenge lockdowns, to be smeared, often to be censored and to be accused of things. But they stood together, they had courage, and they led to stopping many things, like the vaccine mandate that was imposed. And I think we should remember that those that want to silence us, that those that want to deplatform, to censor and cancel are scared. They don't have courage or confidence in their ideas. They're scared of the power of ideas. They think often people are rubbish, ignorant, untrustworthy, and even evil, that when they hear ideas, they will do terrible things. And that's why we have a duty to speak up and to stand together as the many against the few. There are many more battles to be fought, and we've talked about some of them today, but not least the care workers that we think together should be reinstated and compensated. There's questions around compulsory ID that some of us have spoken about today, digital or other. Obviously, freedom of speech and association, which is under assault. There's big tech censorship. There's the question of the online safety bill, which challenging that has led to, looks like, the removal of legal but harmful, but there's still a challenge to be made more broadly against it, I would argue. And democratic accountability all round. To do all this, we need courage, and we need to have a duty to our principles of freedom, democracy, and rights. So I'd ask all of you to be brave and speak up with your fellow colleagues, with friends, with associates and family. To be courageous when you may be shouted down, to be threatened with cancellation. The more of us that do this, the stronger we are, and the stronger that democracy will be, and that's why our duty is to that. The courage of the citizens who are challenging the terrorists on the street, the courage of us to fight for ideas with our fellow citizens. When we do this together, we inspire others around us, we create solidarity, and we change the world together.
Thanks, Alan, and all of you for some really great, different ways of reflecting on this question. I'm just going to go straight out and gather up some thoughts, yeah? We haven't got endless amounts of time. So I'll start here and then there, and then I'll go to the back. Yeah.
What can we do to help Scotland? I mean, it's ridiculous that that they should be, have this subjected on them by such a small minority of people. You know, the vast majority of people in Scotland didn't vote for the SNP. Unfortunately, they couldn't get their act together and sort of vote for other parties and sort of jump on board the Alliance for Unity and stuff like this in order to sort of... but really, it can't be right that there's a part of the United Kingdom that needs to be subjected to this sort of nonsense.
Charlie's inspiring examples of individual bravery reminded me of something I hadn't thought about for a while, which was Boris Johnson, when he was a mayor, saying, if you see streets crime, don't intervene. Don't people remember that? And I think it was in the context of the murder of the soldier in Woolwich. I thought at the time, this is terrible. So, if you're mugged, you just know that no one's going to have your back. Thankfully, we've seen examples since then where people have ignored that sage advice in, terrorist attacks and so on. But it did make me think that bravery is partly emboldened by knowing that other people, the people around us, are going to have their backs, and that's physical but also intellectual and moral. I'm not saying it's all Boris Johnson's fault, he's just an example, but I think there's a cultural problem with that which makes me a bit worried, but I think it does emphasise why we need to follow what Alan was saying and think about work together.
Yeah, you go.
Yeah,
It's
okay,
right there.
we've heard so much today about this technocracy. There's no doubt about it. It's burgeoning, it's creeping, and we need to fight it. And one way that we can fight it is to fight for the pounds in your pocket. The pounds in your pocket. They want to trap us in a central bank digital currency. They do that, it's game over for us. Everybody can make a difference. Take some coins out with you and spend it in a shop. If they say that they don't take cash, say, well, you don't get my business. Thank you.
This gentleman here, then right at the back. Yeah.
Earlier on today, I did hear some actual genuine courage, but I was just a tad disappointed at the response. A young lady raised an issue about the targeting of young white working class girls by Pakistani men. Equally young Pakistani men, because we're talking about it. I felt that the question got shoved. It got shoved not in a. I know there's a lot of other issues going on. For me, that was an example of courage, that someone could come to a place like this and could raise that kind of issue. And I think it's very important that we celebrate those kind of people. Not because that's not it's not the only problem we face, but I'm from Bradford. It's a story that I have heard 100 times. And it's a story that has never actually got anywhere beyond maybe being mentioned at a report in page 65 in a police report or something like that. And it's an issue that really needs to, for the good of the Pakistani community, as well as for the safety of those young girls. And I think those guys, we need more courageous people who are be prepared to challenge these kind of presumptions that we make about race and culture. Because if we don't, we're not going to get it sorted.
Okay, thank you.
Just to build on Alan's point, courage is definitely contagious, but so's cowardice. And I think if you genuinely believe something, you are absolutely certain, you don't stand up for what you believe, nobody else has got a chance. Because once we all start saying what we really believe and challenging ideas, that gains momentum. But on the other side, so does cowardice. If somebody knows you believe something and they see you not say it, they see you keep your mouth shut, if you're not going to make the effort, why should I? And that's why I think we're in the position we are now. Too many people, they say things they don't believe, they go to trainings, they'll talk about it afterwards, out of earshot of HR, but they should be in HR department saying, this is wrong, I should be trained on my job and my job only. You don't teach me what to think, what to believe. That's my decision. But people don't do that because they're scared. So on the other side of that, yeah, that's it.
No, that's a very good point. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. I'd like to suggest perhaps that one of the greatest and hardest acts of courage in today's society is actually being a parent as opposed to being a friend to your child. And we've experienced this now where the education system, the mental health system, the social working system, etc., all seems to devalue parenthood, and to actually stand up and say to your own children, I've heard so many people today say, we daren't say this to our children. Perhaps we need to, and perhaps that's where the greatest act of courage starts at home, and we've got to be speaking out against the narrative that your view isn't any longer valid.
Yeah, just sort of following on from that a little bit, I wanted to ask a bit what you thought should be done with schools and sort of transgender issues, because last term I found myself in my head of year's office in trouble because I refused to use one of my classmates' preferred pronouns. And I was standing by what I thought was right over what I thought was easy. And I was completely rejected by my entire year group, and I didn't find myself very popular at the end of it. Where was my freedom of speech? I tried to live by what I thought was right. I tried to live by my conscience and think, you know what, this is a child. I'm a child. I'm 15. This person at the time was 14. What should I have done? The teachers didn't know what to do. There was no policy on it. I was in my head of year's office being told that if I was in a job, I would have been sacked. Thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a horrible person. By sticking by what I believed in, I didn't find myself very popular, so it's hard to put into practice the freedom of speech thing. I think one thing I've learned most is instead of doing what's easy, do what is right, and I think that's what I lived by.
I think the irony of that contribution is that that's what real leadership looks like. It doesn't make you popular, but it does gain admiration. So heroin, there you go. Yes.
Yeah, so Charlie, when you were speaking, I was thinking of your examples you gave of people jumping in front of cars and all the rest of it, and I thought, in a weird way, the people most likely to be doing that now are sadly Extinction Rebellion, right? But I was thinking, why, aside from me not liking their politics, why do I not think that they kind of have the same ring of true courage that the examples you were giving do? And I think the reason is because courage is inseparable in reality from politics, from being prepared to face people and defend your positions in front of them. And what do Extinction Rebellion do? You try and engage with them and they say, no, well, we're here speaking in the name of future generations of unborn children, i.e. of people who aren't here yet. They don't want to have a debate and discussion. They're not prepared to stand up for what they believe. And this refusal to face other citizens, I mean, that unites all of the cowards of our times, from the HR people that Leo was talking about there, to the technocrats, to paper pushers and people who work in kind of weird NGOs. They're all not prepared to face people and defend them. And what people need, where the courage to stand up and defend yourself comes from, is ideas, is ideologies, is values and principles. And lots of them at the moment, as this gentleman pointed out and that young lady over there, lots of them are deeply unfashionable at the moment. But it's standing up and being prepared to defend them to other people, sometimes at some cost. But that's what makes it real courage, and not the kind of just spurious, kind of demonstrative or performative aspects of politics we see so much of today.
Thank you. Okay. So, just whizzing across the panel, anything you want to pick up, Dennis?
I just think on the issues of trans and whether you can say anything about Muslims, I mean, they're presented as the ultimate victims. I mean, and that gives people in authority moral confidence, right? That's the reason you can't challenge it, because by presenting themselves as protectors of victims, and that goes throughout the whole of the education system, you know, it's really difficult to challenge. I mean, the point I made in response to that is we've internalised the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. Right? That's what's happened to us. The terrible fear offence. And that's the general condition, but people in authority use the few trans people there are, not many trans people, as the ultimate victims to make sure that you're silent, as you're frightened of saying anything about what a Muslim student says to you, because you mustn't offend the victim. And that is the issue. And I mentioned the case of Mila in France, and to Lauren there, where she had a spat with her Muslim schoolmates, and now she's in hiding. The family's being defended, being defended by the police all the time, just for an adolescent spat on Snapchat, I suppose. So I think it is dangerous to speak up, but you should still speak up. It does make you a heroine in that way, but we need more people to do it. It's just, and we keep saying this. It's simple. The more people who speak up, the better. But it isn't easy. To be courageous. We have a heroes and zeros section on our website and apart from the gender critical. We can't find anybody to be a hero. Right? We can find zeros every month. We can't find heroes, right? And we search through all the universities. And we're desperate sometimes, but there's no heroes. So I'd like to have more heroes in academia.
Yeah, I can see your picture going up soon. But anyway, right, right, yeah.
Right, what can you do to support Scotland? First of all, it would be really helpful if you could write to your MPs and highlight the issues that this may cause cross-border, as it will impact actually here in England and Wales. So you should have flyers on the streets that kind of highlight what our concerns are. So if you could write to MPs, that'd be fantastic. Second thing is if you go online to look at the Sex Matters website, you will see there's a petition there for a debate that's going to ask, we're going to ask the Westminster to debate and strengthen the Equality Act, which will actually support us in Scotland. So really 2 key points with that. And you made me cry. Yeah, that's the first time, apparently, you actually made me cry, because I understand the challenges that especially young women are actually going through at school at the moment. And it doesn't make you popular, but it does make you right. And it does make it with us. And these individuals will grow up. Jimmy, and I'm glad that you didn't actually succumb to compelled speech, because that's what it is. Yeah, that's what pronouns are, compelled speech. So.
Charlie.
So yeah, to come back to the gentleman at the back, so most of my friends will know me as somebody who's very critical of XR on many different levels, but I have to say that I disagree that not all of them are brave. I think some of them are, and I think this is part of the conversation I think we need to have. I think across the spectrum here, I think we need to recognising universal attributes about what bravery is and respecting it regardless of where we come from. Now, I happen to agree with you that I think in a lot of cases there's this reluctance to debate. I think that's a particular form of bravery or a particular form of cowardice, whichever side of that sort of issue you might be on. But I think that regardless of that, I think recognising when people are really willing to put themselves on the line for things. I'm not saying that's what's always happened with a lot of these protests, but certainly some of them have certainly done so. And I think where that happens, it warrants respect, if not agreement. And I think that part of this conversation as well is about breaking down these barriers, because I think one of the biggest problems that we've got here, which is really feeding into this crisis where people really don't feel comfortable expressing how they feel and don't feel comfortable saying what they want to say, is this knowledge that the battle lines now are so polarised that you are bound to elicit this extreme reaction from either side of the political debate, really. Everybody's guilty to a degree. We can argue the toss over who's done what more or whatever, but we're living in a very polarised society on a lot of the issues which have just been mentioned. And one of the biggest things, as has been mentioned before, as I've tried to allude to in my speech, and a couple of other people came up with as well, cowardice breeds cowardice as much as bravery breeds bravery. And the knowledge that somebody's going to have your back, or that at least not everybody in your school is going to turn against you, for example, is a crucial part in practice in terms of developing a culture where people are comfortable to have these kind of conversations openly as well. And so, yeah, just as a sort of a mild rebuke, if you will, to that concept, because I think that it's unfair to say that it's not all. I think, in fact, in some cases, a lot of bravery that's gone on with that. But also that, it's for me, that we need to break through this general hostility, and at some point, one side has to be the bigger person in this and say, okay, well, we're going to be the ones to accept some of the validity of what you're doing, admire some of the points, whilst maintaining this respectful disagreement over what it is.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Yeah.
I think the thing is that what terms like respect are tricky, right? So I think that tolerance is a really important idea, and that you tolerate certain things. You tolerate many things and ideas that you don't agree with in behaviours even in society, but you can criticise and challenge. Where the problem has become, I think, just to this point, because I think it's really important, I'm not sure it's that brave when you get brought up at school being told that cars are killing the planet, and every leader from the top down is telling us how terrible we are and we're killing everything, that then you go out and do a performative act, right? Now, some people might do little individual acts, you think, God, it might take a bit of courage to do that. But generally, I don't think it does when you're being celebrated by what the new cultural backdrop is, that's the thing. However, I do think it's really important to be able to engage. James earlier talked about magnanimity, I can't say it properly, but to listen to one another's and understand people's arguments and want to engage with them. Often the problem is we're now seen as fellow citizens as though somehow you're evil if we don't agree with things, or you're like a terrible person. Rather than thinking there are principles to be won, we can do it in a civil fashion. We might really disagree and win people to that and demonstrate it through the way we conduct ourselves. And this is the thing with people who are scared of free speech, who want to shut it down and don't believe in the capacity in our agency as humans to listen, to think things through, to win others over to this position or not, and take the risk of success or failure in something, right? And I think that we can demonstrate that in our activity. One thing I will say is that obviously some of these culture war issues have been terrifying. If you're in an institution or if you've got a position, you can be... But I think in the last year, we've seen an amazing number of things happen from people that have been courageous and get involved, but also when you get the public involved in these discussions, when they get to, rather than it being circumvented and a takeover of the institutions without any public debate, which is what we've seen a bit in the civil service and in the police and in the academy, the minute you bring it into the public and you have to thrash out those issues, you get an honesty, you get an illumination of those ideas. And I think that that's something that we can all do much more, because the way that we can really change things, right, and for the better in the sense of insisting on freedom and democracy and rights, if you think those things are important, is that we get more people involved in that, and we get the public and the honesty of the demos doing that.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Right, let's just grab a few more points, and because we do have to wind up and we do have to go to the pub.
Yeah, so... Is this... Right, good, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, so I would argue that that bravery is often associated with pure acts. So like you were talking about Alan who died, who got beheaded by ISIS. That was a pure act because he was putting his life on the line to do something brave, but altruistic. Yet I would say XR are just provoking a reaction. I would probably say like there have been some protests that I've actually seen that have been like straddling the line between altruistic but at the same time provoking a reaction. And I think the best example was they have it in Manchester, and it's the naked bicycle run. I saw this going through Oxford Road. Literally, loads of naked cyclists. Crazy. Everyone basically was aghast, and it definitely showed what they were actually fighting for.
I'm Marion's co-director. So one of the things we've got going on in Scotland is obviously the lack of definition about what a woman is, but it goes further with lack of definition. So when you come back to the idea of ideas being evil, what we are finding is that we are being told women's words are literal violence. And then that excuses us being met with actual violence. Yeah. So it's not like you were saying in the old days where you could have a face-off between people who were being violent towards you. It's groups of men coming around, like Julie Bindel got punched, or they tried to punch her after a meeting. So we are in this very topsy-turvy world where we need better definitions back in the public discourse as well, because otherwise people are just recreating this world all over anew.
I don't know who said it, but there's a saying that it is much easier to fool somebody than it is to convince them that they've been fooled. And what I think an idea of courage is the ability for somebody who has been fooled to be able to admit that they have been fooled to the people that they've been around, and that the ways that we can create a context to allow people who have been fooled to claw back.
This is a question for you, Dennis. And it's about free speech absolutism. I'll be a little bit brave here and say that I'm slightly anxious about the absolutism bit. And I would love, this isn't obviously the time, to have a conversation about whether there are actually some points at which free speech shouldn't be allowed. Fire is the typical one. But that's, yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that it's not necessarily not contentious what you just said.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, not at all. I just wanted to reflect, when we had a sort of similar but not the same discussion at the London Battle of Ideas, one of the speakers made a point that I thought was quite compelling, which was that we have a culture of defeatism. And he used the example of a young woman who had been the victim of a terrorist incident, a suicide bomb. You know, she'd survived it but was in trauma and depressed, as you might be, a few years later. And the country that she lived in had just okayed her for assisted suicide. And that was that, right? And it was, he did it much better than I've done, right? But I mean, and it was like, he was like, you could hear a pin drop. You thought, oh my God. Modern European societies, the leadership of saying to a young person, we give up on you. Now, it's not as dramatic as your story, but also, we're all saying you're a heroine for being brave. I mean, the reality is, what kind of society abandons teenagers to have to fight those battles on their own? I mean, you said it yourself. You know, these are young people, children technically. I'm sure that you're very mature. And there's grown-ups in the room called teachers and educational authorities. What an indictment. Yeah. So there's something about that defeatism of society that I think we do have to challenge. And then the other thing, I suppose, is, because I don't want to get into the whole Extinction Rebellion thing exactly, but I will say this. I actually have had arguments with people where they've said that suicide bombers are brave. And technically speaking, if you see an act of bravery as sacrificing yourself for a belief, I mean, this is to counter the whole point of this whole thing, but I mean, you could say, but of course I don't think they're brave, do I? I think they're nihilistic and anti-human. And my problem with Extinction Rebellion is their politics is nihilistic and anti-human and anti-democratic. And I know that I'm playing to the crowd here, so I don't want you to clap. Because if I said it anywhere else, I'd be strung up, right? But I'm only making that point because I do think that despite, what I'm saying is it's a bit complicated, right? And the content of what we are brave about does have to be considered at some point. And so I just wanted to say that point about defeatism and nihilism and so on. But also, I have heard today where quite a lot of people have given up on democracy in this audience, right? Quite a lot of people say, what's the point? Do you know what I mean? I'm giving up on each other, you know, the sheeple. Do you know what I mean? I can't be bothered to win arguments with them. Exactly the same point that Extinction Rebellion protesters made to me when I had a row with them. They said, we've tried all the arguments, it doesn't work. Right? It's like, well, you know, you lost the arguments and therefore you're just going to bully us all into submission. I still defend their right to protest and will vote again accordingly against the government on it. But I do think that a sense of defeatism, despite people saying brave words, even here, is a cultural problem that we all confront. And giving up on each other, giving up on winning the arguments, going down rabbit holes and blaming everyone else is not brave, that's all. It takes courage to sometimes realise that you're on the losing side and that you've got a big uphill struggle and that your arguments were not strong enough to convince others. So that's my call to arms, be better. And I say that to myself as much as anyone else. I'm now going to ask the panel to give us their final thoughts and to finish off today, and then I'm going to ask Mo Lovett up just to kind of round off the event before we all go and talk informally about what next. But Dennis, your final thoughts,
Well, Oliver
please.
Wendell Holmes has a lot to answer for his judgment in Schneck in 1919, where he said that argument about fire in a crowded theatre. Somebody should have asked him, what about pressing a fire alarm in a crowded theatre? What's it got to do with speech? Right? There are lots of other examples. But I want to say something positive about what you could do. It's all right saying you've stood up, but it's go beyond what you've done. And I would say to younger students, set up a debating group, set up some sort of discussion group. We have this all the time. And if you go on our website, the AFAF website, we've got friends. And a lot of them now are student groups that have set up themselves. You know, not the academics doing it. Students have done it themselves. Sometimes just one girl, often girls, actually, interestingly, one girl decides she wants to do something about free speech and sets up a group. You know, sometimes they don't last because students cease to be students after a while. But it shows a lot of courage. So rather than just presenting yourself as a heroine or a hero, get other people to talk to you, and that's the way to go forward, you know. Otherwise, you just tell the stories of your heroism. But it's good, but it has no consequence. So I think get more people to talk to, set up a discussion group. That's a very threatening thing to do. It's a very brave thing to do. It's braver almost than the individual act of courage.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Marianne.
To end on a kind of positive note, this has been one of the most terrifying, but also one of the most fantastic times of my life over the past 4 years. I've had death threats, I've had everything. It's been dark, the police are at my door. It's a bit of a nightmare. But it's been really good fun. It really has. I mean, I've met such wonderful people from across all parts of the country and across the wider world that we've kind of established all these kind of women's networks all over the place. It's been wonderful. So, yeah, just, you know, if no one's going to do it, just really get involved. I mean, we go to the pub and, we do a lot of pub things. So, yeah, so don't get nervous about it. Yeah, if you're going to start up and actually stand up for your own beliefs, yeah, it can be terrifying. And, yeah, there are going to be consequences. But the upside is far better than the others. So just, pub.
Yeah, I think both those contributions talk to the importance of solidarity and actually knowing you're not alone. And I think that one of the reasons why it can be terrifying is if you feel you're on your own. But anyway, Charlie, your final thoughts.
Leading on to me. The last thing I thought I was going to be doing in this session was defending Extinction Rebellion. Believe me, it's not considered to be my normal position on things. But I have to disagree. If you speak to an Extinction Rebellion person, I know some of them personally from Manchester. By the way, I don't think the Naked Bike Ride was an official Extinction Rebellion event. It may have been some social crossover. But when you speak to them, and when I speak to people that I know who are involved, they're deeply terrified about what they believe is happening to the planet. They're deeply terrified for the future of their children. And it's not a question of not winning the argument. By everyone's accounts here, they probably have won the argument. It's institutional policy. Yes, everyone agrees with climate change, agree it's happening, agree we have to get to net zero, and yet the changes that they believe need to happen aren't happening. That's why you get a protest movement. So I just wanted to come in here and say that I don't buy that classification. I think it's very unfair in terms of what certain people are willing to put on the line. That's not to say, however, that I don't completely agree with something Alan was saying, and I think probably comes back a little bit to part of the gentleman at the back's point there who brought XR up in the first place, which is being able to tell the difference between false bravery and the performative bravery and real bravery and the real thing. And real bravery is really actually taking a risk and doing something that's going to get you in trouble. And I completely agree with your comments before about this term literal violence. It's been doing my head in for years. As somebody who's had actual literal violence expressed against me for my political opinions, and somebody who's got friends who've had their life nearly ruined by actual literal violence, and etc. So I always used to say, when people talk about being triggered in PTSD, I always used to say, well, being triggered and having PTSD, that's like when my great-granddad came back from the war with shell shock and he couldn't have a drink of whiskey because he thought he was hallucinating. He was back in the trenches fighting the Germans, and my nan's family had to run away from home in the middle of the night like Angela's ashes to go and find somewhere else to live. That's triggering. That's PTSD. It's not feeling uncomfortable in a cinema. So I think you're right. I think the discourse, the language around this is all warped. I think that goes back to what we were trying to say at the beginning about the kind of the discourse and the politics around it. But again, you know, I think that the disagreements which some of us in this room may have around, you know, how we categorise things like XR is also a testament really to the underlying point here, which is that we need to have this space where we can iron out these disagreements. We need to get to more of a common basis of mutual understanding. People disagree with the science around climate change. Those are arguments which need to be had properly in an environment where people don't feel they're being held hostage. And again, that's what's sort of enforcing this culture where everybody feels like a coward.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, we have to remind ourselves that we make this world, right? It might seem like a strange statement, you know, when a lot of people feel that there's very little they can do. But I think this point about human agency, our ability to change things, to curate stuff, to decide on things, to use our judgment, to execute decisions, right? And to work with one another and to argue and have discussions in the workplace with our friends and family, but go beyond that as well. I think that the thing about our agency, human agency, that we can actually do things, and the idea of wealth creation for everyone, innovation, ingenuity, the idea that everything we do is not terrible and destructive and evil, but actually can be beautiful and transformative and incredible. And I also have thought that in this terrible last couple of years, there's been some really, you know, I've met many people I would never have met before, and there's an opportunity for all of us. I've been in these discussions earlier on today, and I was very inspired when Mo was talking about the moments and experience of Brexit, and then now a lot of people are sort of very understandably disappointed. We've got beyond disappointed. Some people are just downright cynical, and they think, well, it's all going to be the same. This always happens, right? You do something, and then these technocrats are in place. I think there's an enormous opportunity right now, historically, for people to have an impact in the world. I think it's incumbent on us. We have a duty to try and present the kind of world that we think we want to see, to argue with our fellow citizens, to take the risk that you might not win, to experiment with that and explore and persevere with it. And I think if we do that, you'll be surprised by some of the results, right? Because the people that run things are not at all strong. They have very little principle. And it's not just about a lack of leadership. It's when you're not accountable to your constituents or to a broader sense of the demos, you can't actually give a proper lead, right? And when you aren't accountable to a set of principles. And I think we've got an opportunity to, it's not going to happen overnight, but to reform and rethink and work together with other people. And there's some people here from different regions that are from Together Association. If you haven't come across us, I'd say, you know, join us, get involved. We actually want to have an impact and change things. And I think all of us can do that, right? And in a way, the limits are just our belief and conviction in that.
Okay. No. We're done now. I'm going to ask Mo to come up. I actually think that Charlie made a very important point, and just to as our final thought, while Mo's getting ready to come up, I don't know where she is, I can't see her. She's there. Right, is that there's been a lot of people today rightly feeling that their political concerns are caricatured and lampooned, and it's also the case that I was thinking that actually I find it easier to imagine having a physical fight with the NF than actually, no, but in all seriousness, than being called a bigot and a racist. I mean, that's worse for me. And you kind of feel like I'm so viscerally outraged that anyone would think that. It's almost like you think, well, actually, I don't mind having a bit of a punch-up in comparison, because there's nothing worse than if you aren't feeling that people think you are. And that's what makes you a kind of coward. But we've all said, and loads of people have said in different ways, I can't bear it when people do that. So the reason why what I'm saying that is that regardless of what I think about the Extinction Rebellion or anything else, it's also true that we're never going to win an argument if we caricature those people we disagree with. So it is also the case that just name-calling, all the rest of it. So we have to bear that in mind too. So I think that was a useful lesson for me from one of the things that Charlie said. I'm going to ask Mo to come up, but I personally just wanted to extend my thanks to the people who put on this event, and just my name checked, because I know that's going to happen, is that Ruth and Dennis and the whole team at Derby University Hilary has been fantastic in helping us organise this. From our office, Jeff and Simon and Leo, who made that great point at the end, who works tirelessly for NOUT, for the Academy of Ideas, and we really do appreciate it. And of course to Mo herself, who's helped promote it. Can I just put my thanks for them turning an idea into a reality? That takes a bit of bravery as well.